He came back as the alpha. She had spent 5 years building a life that did not need him, a practice, a reputation, a self that could stand without the support of a bond she had tried her hardest to smother. She had learned to sleep without the hum of his presence. She had learned to make decisions that had nothing to do with the pull in her chest that pointed north like a compass needle she could not break. She had learned to look at the version of herself that had been driven out of a forest at 19 with nothing but a bag and a bleeding hand, and she had taken that girl and done something extraordinary with her. And now he was standing at the edge of her territory, which happened to be her office building, in November rain, with an appointment she had agreed to because the case was legitimate and the money was real, and she had not known until she looked at the file and saw the name that it was him. She knew it was him before she opened the door. Before we go any further, if dark romance with real teeth is what you came for, stories where the love is complicated and the betrayal is real and the redemption is earned and not given, hit subscribe right now. For new stories, wolves, magic, revenge, and the kind of slow burn that makes you forget to breathe. Subscribe before the next chapter starts. Chapter 1: The Girl Left Behind. The Ashbourne Pack occupied several thousand acres of forest in the northern part of the state, the kind of territory that had been held by wolf families since before the roads were laid down, since before the highway cut through what used to be continuous woodland. The pack had adapted to the modern world the way all old institutions adapt, grudgingly and selectively, maintaining its internal structures and hierarchies while presenting a more legible face to the human world surrounding it. Mara Voss had grown up on the eastern edge of that territory, in a house that was technically pack property but felt peripheral in the way that describes more than geography. Her father, Dex Voss, had been an enforcer for 22 years, solid and dependable and well-regarded in the practical way that people who do necessary work are regarded without ever being celebrated. He had loved a human woman named Claire, had brought her into the territory, and had spent 3 years watching the subtle machinery of pack social pressure do what blunt hostility could not, which was to make her feel so completely that she did not belong that she left. She left Mara behind because Dex had made arguments about the difficulty of raising a shifter child in a human environment, arguments that had the quality of truth to them even though their primary function was to keep his daughter close. Claire had kissed Mara on the forehead on a Sunday morning and driven away in a car packed with the things that mattered to her, and Mara had stood on the porch of the peripheral house and watched the car until she could not see it anymore. She was 6. She did not cry on the porch. She cried later, alone in her room, with the kind of silent efficiency that children develop when they have learned that visible grief invites unwanted attention. She was already learning the particular skills of someone who understands themselves to be an inconvenience. Dex was not a bad father. He was present and protective, and he tried, in the way of men who express care through reliability rather than words, to give her everything she needed. What he could not give her was status or belonging or the easy acceptance of a community that had already categorized her before she was old enough to have a self. The Hollis family lived 4 properties to the west, which in territory terms meant a 10-minute walk through woods that Mara knew as well as she knew the inside of her own house. The Beta and his wife and their 2 sons, Remus and Cade, occupied the second most significant position in the pack hierarchy and the social reality that came with it. Remus was older by 4 years and already had the quality of someone who understood their own importance. Cade was different. Cade was, from the beginning, different. He had found her at 9 years old standing at the edge of the creek that ran between their properties, throwing stones at nothing in particular with the focused intensity of someone with something to work out. He had come up beside her and picked up a stone of his own and thrown it, and neither of them had said anything for several minutes, and then he had said, "That one was better than yours," and she had said, "You have longer arms," and he had laughed. And that had been the beginning. They grew up as the kind of friends that come from proximity and temperament finding each other, the kind that have a private language built from shared references and years of small ordinary moments. He brought her into things she would not otherwise have been part of, not by announcing her or advocating loudly, but simply by including her with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who does not understand why she would be excluded. She did not know then how much that cost him in small social currencies. She understood it better later. The bond came when she was 17 and he was 19, on a Tuesday morning in early spring when the forest was doing the tentative thing it does at that time of year, everything pale green and smelling of mud and possibility. She was standing in her father's kitchen making coffee, and she felt it happen, felt the specific new weight of it in her chest, felt the particular direction it pointed like something had installed a compass in her sternum overnight. She stood very still for a moment. Then she knew he was at the edge of the forest 50 yards from the back door. She went out to him. He was standing at the tree line, and he looked like someone who had just received news that required significant reorganization of his understanding of things. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. Then he said, "Did you feel that?" She said, "Yes." He said, "What do we do?" She said, "I do not know." He sat down on the back step, and she sat beside him, and they stayed there for a long time while the morning progressed around them and the bond settled into something steadier, something that felt less like an event and more like a permanent condition. He took her hand. She felt the warmth of it move up her arm and through her chest, and she thought, with the whole body certainty that only comes a few times in a life, this is real, and this is mine, and whatever happens, I will always have had this moment. She was 17. She did not yet know what could be taken. For 2 years they were careful. The carefulness was his idea, and she understood it mostly. His position required discretion. The Beta heir's personal life was pack business in ways that regular pack members' lives were not. A bond with a half-blood would require managing, conversations with his father, negotiations with the pack's political reality. He said all of this to her, and it all made sense, and she believed him, and she told herself that temporary caution was not the same as shame. She told herself many things. She noticed that Remus watched them. Remus had the quality that some eldest sons of powerful men develop, a kind of constant political awareness, an assessment of every situation for its implications to the family position. He watched Mara with an expression she found difficult to read, not warm and not hostile, but calculating, the way you look at a variable you have not yet determined the value of. She noticed that the pack was beginning to talk, the way packs talk, with an underground current of comment and inference that surfaces in particular looks and particular silences, and the way conversations stop when you walk into a room. She noticed, and she told herself it was manageable, that Cade was managing it, that trust was the currency they were trading in. The autumn when she turned 19, the old alpha called a formal gathering. His name was Jarrett Hollis, and he was a large and largely quiet man who ran the pack with a combination of genuine authority and delegated confidence. He announced that a new alliance with the Greyfield pack had been formalized. Part of this alliance would be a formal introduction between the Ashbourne Beta heir and the Greyfield Alpha's daughter. Mara was standing across the room from Cade when this was announced. She felt him go still in the way she could feel him, through the bond, through the years of knowing the particular language of his body. She did not look at him. She looked at the Alpha, and she listened to the words, and she let the meaning of them arrive at their own pace. Potential match. Formal introduction. The Greyfield daughter's name was Petra, and she would arrive in 2 weeks. Mara left the gathering. She went to the clearing by the stream where they had met 100 times, the flat rock by the water that had been their place since they were children, and she sat there in the October cold and she waited. He came. She knew he would come, and she knew from the quality of his approach through the bond that this was not going to be a conversation she wanted to have. He sat beside her on the rock and he said, "You know this was always a possibility." She said nothing. He said, "Mara, my position requires certain things. A Beta heir cannot simply follow personal preference. The pack's stability depends on alliances, and alliances depend on how the Beta and eventually the Alpha present themselves and who they bond with." She said, "What do you want?" He said, "That is not the relevant question." She said, "It is the only question. Tell me what you want." He was quiet for a long time. The stream moved. An owl called from somewhere in the dark trees. He said, "It does not matter what I want. You do not understand what it means to be in this position. Some of us do not get to simply want things and then pursue them. Some of us have obligations that are larger than personal feeling." She heard what was underneath that. She heard the implication that she, lacking those obligations, lacking that position, was free to want things precisely because she was nothing. Because she had no obligations, because she had no standing, because she was the half-blood girl in the peripheral house and her wants existed in a vacuum of irrelevance. She stood up. He said, "Mara, please." She said, "I heard you." She was turning to leave when Remus came out of the trees. He came with 2 enforcers, large men she recognized as belonging to the more politically aligned part of the pack's enforcement structure. He came with the particular expression of someone executing a plan they have made peace with. He said, "In the formal register he used for pack decisions, it has been determined that continued association between you and the Beta heir creates a complication for the pack's political position. It would be better for everyone if you were to relocate." She looked at Cade. He was looking at the ground. The understanding arrived with the flatness of things that are too large to feel all at once. He had told Remus where they would be. He had known this was coming. The conversation had been preparation, a way of softening a blow he had known was coming because he had helped plan it. She said, "You told him where to find me." Cade said nothing. One of the enforcers moved toward her, and she stepped back and her heel caught on a root and she went down, catching herself on her palm, rock cutting into skin, blood on the dark ground. She got up slowly. She looked at her bleeding hand. She looked at Cade. He still would not look at her. Remus said, "You have until morning." She looked at the forest she had known since she was 6 years old. She looked at the stream and the rock and the trees that had witnessed 10 years of her life. She looked at the man who had held her hand in the morning sunlight. She did not say anything. She walked back through the dark to her father's house, packed 1 bag, and drove. Chapter 2. What 5 Years Builds. In the city her mother cried and asked no questions and made up the spare room and sat with her through the first 3 days, which were the worst. Mara did not cry, not in those first days, not in the way her mother expected. She felt too large for crying, too full of something that did not have a simple name, grief and rage and the specific bitterness of someone who understands they have been used. The mate bond did not go away. She had expected, perhaps, that leaving the territory would diminish it the way pack bonds diminished with distance. It did not. The mate bond was a different kind of connection, not dependent on proximity, and it followed her into the city and into her mother's spare room and into the night hours when she lay awake and felt him at the other end of it, distant but present, a signal she could not stop receiving. She spent 2 months researching options before she found the suppression medication. It was a compound developed by a half-blood biochemist in another city who had spent 20 years working on the intersection of wolf physiology and human pharmacology. Someone who understood what it meant to have a connection in your body that you could not consent to or escape. The medication did not sever the bond. Nothing severed a true mate bond. What it did was reduce the signal to something she could live with, a frequency she was aware of but no longer dominated by, a hum rather than a roar. She took it every day for 5 years. She enrolled in university the following autumn, 2 years older than most of her incoming class, with the focused efficiency of someone who has identified exactly what they want to become and has no interest in taking the scenic route. She chose environmental law because it was a field where wolf territory disputes lived, where the intersection of human development and non-human rights created cases that no one else quite knew how to handle. It was a practical decision. It was also a decision that kept her connected, carefully and at a controlled distance, to the world she had come from. She graduated in 3 years instead of 4. She passed the bar on the first attempt. She found Danny Chin waiting tables in a restaurant near the courthouse, working her way through her own law degree with the kind of determined practicality that Mara recognized immediately as kindred. They became partners in the first year, then found a third partner named Marcus, then found a small office in a building that smelled like old carpet and possibility. The practice grew. Not quickly, not the overnight success of the kind of story that gets told in profiles of notable young attorneys. Slowly, case by case, reputation building the way real reputations build, through the accumulation of actual results. She won cases that other lawyers had declined because they looked unwinnable. She developed a specialty in challenging boundary reclassifications that had been made in bad faith or on the basis of compromised survey data, which turned out to be a specialty with considerable demand. She also built the network. This was the part of her professional life that existed outside the courtroom and the filing system, the informal community of half-bloods and pack-adjacent people who had, like her, ended up in cities for various political reasons. They were everywhere, more than the packs ever acknowledged, and they had more information than the packs suspected because the packs were not paying attention to people they considered irrelevant. Through this network, she had followed what happened at Ashbourne. The Greyfield Alliance, the reason she had been expelled, collapsed within 18 months. Petra, the daughter whose arrival had been the occasion for Mara's removal, had turned out to have strong opinions about where and with whom she would be mated, and those opinions did not align with what Remus and the old Alpha had planned. She returned to Greyfield. The alliance frayed. The Greyfield pack, insulted, shifted their political attention to Ashbourne's eastern neighbors. Then the old Alpha died. A hunting accident, officially. The unofficial conversation in the network was more complicated and pointed toward a kind of arranged circumstance that Mara could not confirm and therefore did not repeat. Then Remus made a series of decisions that the pack's elder council found troubling. Land transactions with irregularities. Enforcement patterns that felt punitive and personal. An internal culture shift away from the relative equity that Jarrett Hollis had maintained toward something harder and more exclusive. Then Cade left the territory. This was the part Mara had found most difficult to piece together. He had been gone for almost 2 years, during which period Remus's leadership had become increasingly unstable. When Cade came back, he came back with alliances he had built during his absence and a coalition within the pack that had been waiting for exactly this kind of leadership alternative. The transition from Remus to Cade had happened within a month of his return. The details were not public. The result was definitive. Cade was the Ashbourne Alpha. She had sat with this information for a while when it arrived through the network. She had sat with the complicated feeling of it, the part of her that thought, good, someone who cares should lead that pack, and the part that thought about the clearing by the stream and the sound of Remus's voice and the way Cade had looked at the ground. 6 months after he became Alpha, a representative from the Ashbourne pack contacted her office about a land rights matter. The representative had clearly done their research, citing her specific wins in territorial boundary cases. The matter was legitimate and significant and fell precisely within her expertise. She had agreed to take the meeting. She had looked at the file and seen the Alpha's name, and she had sat with that for a while in the quiet of her office. Then she had stopped taking the suppression medication. She wanted to know what she actually felt, without the chemical management, before she walked into that room. She wanted to know the real signal before she decided how to respond to it. She prepared the way she always prepared, which was to know more than the other side expected her to know. She arranged the office, she reviewed the documents, she made coffee because her hands needed something to do. And then she felt him in the elevator, and the bond came roaring back, and she understood that 5 years of careful suppression had not changed a single fundamental thing. Chapter 3. The Language of Wolves. He arrived at 2 o'clock precisely, which was when the appointment was scheduled, because he was exactly the kind of person who arrives when he says he will. She stood up from behind her desk, and she extended her hand, and she said, "Mr. Hollis. Thank you for coming." He took her hand. 2 seconds of contact. The warmth moved up her arm exactly as it always had, and she withdrew her hand with professional smoothness and gestured toward the chair, and she sat down, and she opened the file. They worked for 40 minutes, and it was, despite everything, genuinely productive. He was well prepared. He understood the legal issues at a structural level. He asked precise questions. She had worked with enough clients to know that this kind of intelligence in a consultation was not as common as it should be. When the professional portion of the meeting reached its natural end, she closed the file. He said, "I need to tell you some things." She said, "You do not owe me an explanation." He said, "I owe you more than I can repay." That is a different statement. She said nothing. He said, "After you left, I spent a year constructing a version of what happened that I could live with. A version in which I had made a difficult but correct decision, in which the pack's needs had taken precedence over personal feeling, in which I had acted with appropriate responsibility. I was very skilled at maintaining that version." She kept her face neutral. He said, "Then I watched the thing I had sacrificed you for fall apart. The Greyfield Alliance was worthless inside of 18 months. And I watched Remus, who had constructed the same argument I had, who had used the same language about pack stability and necessary sacrifice, use that language to justify things that had nothing to do with the pack's stability and everything to do with his own position. And I understood, finally, that I had been using a real principle to do something that was not principled at all. I had used it to avoid standing for you, which would have been hard and which I had not wanted to do." He said, "What I did was wrong. I allowed you to be expelled from the only home you had known because being honest about what you meant to me would have required a confrontation I was not willing to have." That is the accurate description of it. The air in the office was very still. She said, "I know." He said, "I did not expect you to forgive me easily. Or at all. I am not here to ask for that." She said, "Then what are you here to ask for?" He said, very quietly, "Nothing tonight. Except that you know that I know what I did. And that whatever comes after this, you have that." She looked at him for a long time. She said, "The bond came back at full strength the moment you walked in. I stopped taking the suppression medication 2 weeks ago when I saw your name on the file. I wanted to know what I actually felt." He said, "What did you feel?" She said, "I have not decided yet what to do with it." He said, "That is a fair place to be." She said, "Your time is up. I have a client call." He stood. At the door he turned. He said, "You built something remarkable. I had 3 different sources tell me you were the best in your specialty before I ever looked at your name. I want you to know I noticed that." She said, "Noted." He left. She remained in her chair for several minutes, hands flat on the closed file, feeling the bond hum steadily in her chest like a pilot light that had been turned back up to full. Then she called her partner Danny. She said, "I need you to cover my 3 o'clock. Danny said, "Done." "You okay?" Mara said, "I will be." She intended to make that true. 3 weeks later, she drove to the Ashbourne territory for the first time in 5 years. She drove herself alone in her own car, having declined the offer of an escort. She wanted to be in her own vehicle with her own music and the ability to leave whenever she chose. She wanted to arrive on her own terms. The forest was exactly as she remembered it. Old and dense and serious, the kind of forest that makes you aware of how recent human concerns are relative to the concerns of trees. The road that led through the territory was paved now where she remembered it being gravel in places, a small update that somehow made the continuity of everything else more striking. She felt the pack boundary when she crossed it. She felt the collective presence of the pack the way she had always felt it, the background hum of many connected lives sharing a territory, muted for her because she was not fully of it but present, undeniable. A frequency she had first learned to identify as a child and never entirely forgotten. And immediately, clearly, she felt Cade. Not far. The bond located him on the property with the precision of a homing mechanism that had been recalibrated after years of suppression. The woman who met her was named Sarah, head of internal affairs, with the quality of someone who has reached a position of responsibility through actual competence rather than proximity to power. She informed Mara that the Alpha had been delayed at the northern border. Then she paused and said, "You grew up here." Voss's daughter. Mara said, "Yes." Sarah said, "I was a junior enforcer back then. I remember you." She paused. "What happened to you is not right. A number of us knew it at the time." Mara said, "But not enough of you said so." Sarah said, "No. Not enough of us said so." A silence. Mara said, I appreciate you saying it now. They went inside. Cade arrived 40 minutes later with forest dirt on his jacket from whatever had needed handling at the northern border. He stood in the doorway and took in the spread of documents on the table and said, I am sorry I am late. The Kellner Group has been pushing equipment right at the tree line. I needed to see it in person. She said, tell me exactly what you saw. He sat down and told her, in detail, and the detail was precise and useful. They worked together for 2 hours with the focused efficiency of two people whose different types of knowledge fitted together without waste. He knew the land and the pack's history. She knew the legal architecture. At some point she looked up from her notes and found him watching her. She said, what? He said, you remind me of yourself. She said, that sentence does not make sense. He said, you remind me of who I always thought you would become. The person I could see back then, before I stopped being part of watching it happen. She set down her pen. She said, Cade. He said, I know. Documents. She said, documents. But something had shifted in the room, and they both knew it, and neither of them acknowledged it, which was itself an acknowledgement. Chapter 4. The Price of Old Debts. Remus came to her office on a Wednesday morning without an appointment. Danny delivered the news with the careful tone she used when she suspected the information was significant. Mara told her to send him in. He was larger than she remembered. Not taller, but denser, the kind of physical change that comes from years of a certain kind of life. He sat down across from her without being invited and he said, I am not here about the case. She said, I assumed. He said, I want to talk about what you are doing with my brother. She said, I am his attorney on a land rights matter. That is a professional relationship. He said, I am not talking about the land rights matter. She looked at him with the expression she used for witnesses she had not yet decided about. He said, Cade has built something at Ashbourne. Something real. He has corrected, to the extent that anything can be corrected, a number of the mistakes I made during my leadership. The pack is more stable and more equitable than it was under me, and I am aware that this is partly because of my own failures. I have made peace, or something like peace, with that. She said, what position do you hold now? He said, senior counsel to the Alpha. A non-executive role. Cade's idea, which I believe was partly intended to keep me occupied and partly an effort to make use of what I know about the pack's history and networks. It is a more honest use of my abilities than leading was. She said, why are you here, Remus? He said, because there is a threat to what Cade has built, and it is connected to you, and he does not know how close it is. She said, tell me. He said, the pack historian. Asta. She has been with the pack for 45 years, and she documented the night you were expelled in a way that frames what happened as correct pack management. She has not released that documentation publicly within the pack. But she is watching what is developing between you and Cade, and she is preparing to release it if she determines the bond is progressing in the direction she fears. She said, and what does she fear? He said, she fears a future that the documents she has spent her life creating do not support. She fears a pack that does not look like the pack she has devoted herself to. She is 70 years old, and she has given everything to an institution, and the idea that the institution might change in ways that render her life's work irrelevant is, to her, a kind of death. Mara said, what happens if she releases the record? He said, there is a faction in the pack, smaller than it was 2 years ago but still meaningful, that will use it to argue that Cade's judgment is compromised. That he has allowed personal attachment to override pack welfare. They will not be able to remove him. His position is too solid. But they will make things difficult for a period. He said, and for you personally, within the pack, there will be people who are hostile in ways that may not be pleasant or safe. She said, does Cade know you are here? He said, no. A silence. She said, why are you warning me? He said, after a moment, because I spent years doing what Asta is preparing to do. Making decisions for other people in the name of what was best for the pack without examining whether my understanding of what was best was accurate or whether I simply wanted a particular outcome and was finding justifications. I am trying to be a different kind of person now. It is not easy and I am not certain I am succeeding. She said, This is unexpectedly honest. He said, I find that dishonesty is more expensive in the long run. He said, if you go and speak with Asta directly, I believe something might change. She is not a bad person. She is afraid. Those are different things. He stood. He said, my brother, despite everything I did to prevent it, is a better alpha than I would have been. I believe you are part of the reason for that. He has been carrying what he did to you for 5 years, and the carrying of it has made him more careful about the weight he puts on others. He said, I am not asking you to forgive him. I am asking you to consider that what is happening now is not the same as what happened then. He left. She sat with the silence for a long time. Then she called Cade. She told him everything, including the part where she said she was not certain Remus should be trusted, and that she was telling him because transparency seemed more useful than strategy. He listened without interrupting, which she had come to recognize as his listening quality. When she finished, there was a pause. He said, I should have told you about Asta. I was managing it, and I did not want to trouble you with something I thought I had contained. She said, when you manage things without telling me you are managing them, you are making a decision about what I need to know. That is not a decision you get to make. A silence. He said, you are right. I am sorry. She said, I am going to go and talk to her. He said, you do not have to. She said, I know. I want to. He said, why? She said, because she is a person, not a problem. And because if I am going to be part of this pack's future, which I have not decided but which I am not ruling out, I need to understand what I am actually dealing with. He said, Mara. She said, yes. He said, thank you for approaching this the way you do. She said, do not thank me. I am approaching it the way I approach everything, which is by trying to understand the actual situation clearly. It is not generosity. It is methodology. He said, can I come? She said no. Chapter 5. OSTA and Old Bones. Asta's house was surrounded by the accumulated density of a life devoted to documentation, archive cabinets and labeled boxes, and the particular order of someone who has thought carefully about how information should be organized. The woman herself was small and white-haired and sharp-eyed, the alertness of very old wolves who have not let the years reduce their attention. She looked at Mara in the doorway and said, I wondered when you would come. Mara said, may I come in? Asta stepped aside. They sat across from each other with tea that Asta made with the practiced efficiency of someone who had hosted difficult conversations many times before this one. Mara said, I am not here to ask you to change the record. Asta said, I know. If you were here for that you would have brought an argument. You are here as yourself. Mara said, yes. She said, I want to ask you something. In 45 years of documenting this pack's history, how many half-bloods are in those records? Asta said, many. She said, and how are they documented? As pack members. Or as half-bloods who were associated with pack members? A pause. Asta said, the distinction you are drawing is understood. She said, in the record you have of the night I was expelled. How am I described? Asta said, as a half-blood female with an unsanctioned attachment to the Beta Air. She said, my name is Mara Voss. My father served this pack as an enforcer for 22 years. I grew up in this territory. I attended pack gatherings and pack schools, and I contributed to the pack's activities in the ways that were open to me, which were limited because of my status, but not because of my choices. I was expelled at 19 because my existence was politically inconvenient. That is what happened. Your record called it relocation. I am telling you what it actually was to the person it was made about. Asta was quiet. She said, you are not a bad person. Remus told me that, and I believe him. You have devoted your life to something you believe in, and I am not here to take that away from you. She said, I am here because I want you to look at me as a person rather than as a category. I have sat in your records as a notation for 5 years. Half-blood female. Unsanctioned attachment. I have been a problem to be managed in the historical record of a pack I was born into. She said, Cade is building something different. Whether I am part of it or not, whether this bond leads where it might lead or not, he is trying to build a pack that looks at people rather than categories. And I want to know whether the historian of that pack is going to record it accurately or whether she is going to record it the way it would have been recorded by the pack that came before. A very long silence. The fire in Asta's small fireplace shifted and settled. Asta said, "You are very like your father." Mara said, "You knew him." Asta said, "I documented him. I documented his service and his competence and his contributions. And I documented his mate and her departure and the circumstances that led to it." She stopped. She said, "I documented it accurately. But I did not document it fully. There are many things in these records that are accurate and incomplete. That is a different kind of failure than inaccuracy. It is a more comfortable failure, which is why it persists." Mara did not say anything. She let the silence work. Asta said, "What is it that you want?" Mara said, "I want you to consider, when you decide what to do with the record, whether releasing it serves the pack or serves your fear. Those are not the same thing. You are a historian. You know the difference between preserving what was and protecting what you wish had been." She said, "The pack Cade is building needs a historian who can record it honestly, including its changes, including the ways it is different from what came before. That requires someone with your level of knowledge and your years of documentation. But it also requires someone who can see the new thing clearly rather than only through the lens of the old one." She stood. She nodded and left. She drove back to the city in the early evening with the last light of November coming through the trees at that horizontal angle that makes everything look briefly like its most essential self. She did not know what Asta would decide. She had done what she could do. Her phone rang. "Cade," he said, "how did it go?" She said, "I do not know yet. I said what I came to say. The rest is her decision." He said, "Mara." She said, "Yes." He said, "Thank you for going." She said, "Stop thanking me for things." A pause, and then she heard something in his breath that she recognized, which was the almost laugh he used to make when she said something that landed exactly right. She said, "You are not allowed to laugh." He said, "I am not laughing." She said, "Good." She was smiling at the road, and she was aware that she was smiling, and she did not do anything about it. The land case concluded 3 weeks before the winter solstice, with a ruling in the pack's favor. The judge found the 1987 reclassification invalid on the basis of the surveying company's undisclosed conflict of interest. The developer's claim was reduced to the area inside the corrected original boundaries. 80 acres of old forest remained under pack jurisdiction. The Kellner Group announced an appeal, which Mara assessed as having less than a 20% chance of succeeding. She called Cade with a ruling. She said, "We won." He said, "You won." She said, "The pack won." That is the accurate description. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Come up this weekend. There is a winter gathering, the solstice one. We have always held it. I want you to be there." She said, "In what capacity?" He said, "In whatever capacity you choose. As a person. As someone who has reason to be here." She said, "Cade." He said, "I know what I am asking. I am not asking for anything beyond your presence." She said, "I will think about it." Chapter 6. What Comes Home. She thought about it for 2 days. She thought about it in the methodical way she thought about complex cases, identifying the variables and the risks and the possible outcomes. She was good at this. She had made herself good at it because she had learned that feelings without structure were a liability and that even feelings deserved to be understood clearly before they were acted on. The variables were these. The bond was real, and it had been real for 7 years, and suppressing it had not diminished it, and pretending it did not exist had not made the pretense comfortable. The bond pointed toward something that was, biologically and in whatever passed for the spiritual register of wolf experience, genuine and specific, and not available in any other direction. Cade had done something wrong. He had done it deliberately, with planning, and the doing of it had caused her years of pain and required her to rebuild herself from the beginning. That was not nothing. That was not the kind of thing you decided to overlook, because the person afterward was better. Overlooking it would be an insult to the person she had made herself into, who had made herself into something formidable precisely because of what was done to her. But she sat with the but for a long time. He had not asked her to overlook it. He had not offered her an excuse or a reframe or a version of events in which he had been less wrong than he had been. He had named it accurately, and he had sat with her knowledge of it, and he had not tried to move past it faster than she was willing to move. He had waited. He was still waiting. She thought about her mother, who had said over the phone months ago, "You are allowed to want good things. You do not have to earn them through suffering first." She thought about the back porch when she was 17, the specific weight of his hand, the warmth that had moved through her like something establishing itself as permanent. She thought about the woman she was now, who was not the girl on that porch and who would not be returning as her. She was returning as herself, with everything she had built, and the version of the future being offered to her would have to accommodate all of that completely. She called Cade on a Friday morning. She said, "I am coming." He said, "Okay." She said, "I need you to understand some things." He said, "Tell me." She said, "My practice is in the city. My partners are in the city. My life, the one I built, is in the city, and I am not trading it in for any version of territory life that requires me to give that up." He said, "I know." She said, "If this is going anywhere, and I am not saying it is, it will have to accommodate that fully and without resentment." He said, "The pack maintains a city residence. I have been reviewing the administrative structure, and there is no structural reason the Alpha cannot spend substantial time there. I have 2 deputies who are fully capable of managing daily operations." She said, "You have been planning this." He said, "I have been preparing for a possibility I did not have the right to plan for." She said, "That is a careful distinction." He said, "I have been practicing careful distinctions." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Has there been any communication from Asta?" He said, "She came to me 2 days after you spoke with her. She said she had decided not to release the record in its current form. She said she wanted to talk about what an updated version of the historical documentation might look like. One that engaged more fully with what the pack had lost as well as what it had preserved." He paused. He said, "She asked about your father. She asked me to tell you that she intends to revisit his documentation. That she believes she was not accurate enough the first time." Mara held the phone and she felt something move in her chest that was not the bond, or not only the bond, but something older and more private, the grief of a daughter who had watched her father be made into a notation. She said, "Good." He said, "Saturday. You will come." She said, "Saturday." She arrived on a Saturday afternoon in the last light of the year, the sky the particular pale gray of northern winter that has its own kind of beauty if you know how to look at it. The trees were bare and the forest showed its architecture, all structure and no concealment, and she drove through it and felt the territory surround her with the specific familiarity of something known in the body, in the bone. In the kind of memory that does not require thinking to access. She crossed the boundary line. She felt the pack. She felt him immediately, the bond locating him in the clearing ahead the way it had always located him, a direction more than a distance, her own private north. She parked near the edge of the clearing where the winter gathering was already in progress, fires lit against the early dark, the pack in its social arrangements, children and elders and the middle generations who did the daily work of maintaining a community. She sat for a moment in her car and she breathed. She said to herself, quietly and firmly, "You are here as yourself. You will not be smaller than you are to make anyone more comfortable. You will not pretend the history is not the history. And you will not let the fear of what was take away what might be." Then she got out. Sarah was at the edge of the clearing. She came toward Mara with the same professional manner she had shown on the first visit, and then she said, quietly, "Glad you came back." Mara said, "Thank you." She walked toward the fires. There were eyes on her. She felt them the way you feel being watched, that old animal awareness, and she let them look. She had spent too many years of her life trying to reduce herself to the proportions that would make people comfortable with her presence. She was done with that. She was here and she was whole and they could look. Cade came to her. He came from across the clearing with the unhurried directness that was one of the qualities she most recognized in him, the way he moved through space as though he had decided on his destination and was not interested in performing the journey. He was in working clothes, not formal things, and he looked like someone who belonged precisely where he was. He stopped in front of her. He said, "You came." She said, "I said I would." He said, "I know." I was not entirely certain. She said, "I thought about changing my mind 4 times on the drive." He said, "What kept you coming?" She said, "Stubbornness. And the forest. And other things." He said, "What other things?" She looked at him. She said, "You know what other things." He said, "I want to hear you say it." A pause. She felt the bond move between them, steady and real and no longer muffled, the full version of the thing they had been carrying separately for 5 years. She said, "You. The other things include you. Though I reserve the right to find that inconvenient at various points." He said, "That seems entirely fair." He offered her his arm. The old formal gesture. The public one that had meaning in wolf culture. The declaration that was not a demand. She looked at it. She thought about the girl who had been expelled from this clearing with nothing but a bag and a bleeding hand. She thought about the woman who had come back on her own terms with everything she had made. She thought about the 5 years between, which had been hard and lonely and extraordinary, and which she would not have traded because they had made her exactly herself. She took his arm. The gathering rearranged itself around this fact. She felt it, the subtle social recalibration as people processed what they were seeing, the future being indicated by the simple contact. There would be those who welcomed it, and those who would need time, and those who might never entirely welcome it, and she was prepared to exist in all of those realities simultaneously because she was not here for anyone's comfort but her own. Near the far fire she found Asta. The old historian was standing alone with a cup held in both hands, watching the gathering with the attention of someone who has spent decades recording what they see. She met Mara's eyes across the fire. She nodded. It was not warm and it was not cold. It was the nod of someone who has looked at something clearly and made a decision and was indicating that the decision had been made. It was acknowledgement. It was, Mara thought, the beginning of something that might, over time, become more than acknowledgement. Cade said, very quietly, "Are you all right?" She said, "Ask me that again in a year." He said, "I intend to ask you that for considerably longer than a year." She said, "We will see about that." He said, "We will." They stood at the edge of the fire and the winter dark was around them and the pack moved through its gathering and somewhere in the trees an owl called once, clearly, into the cold air. The bond in her chest was steady, not the desperate urgent thing of reunion and not the muffled diminished thing of 5 years of management, but something that felt, finally, like what it had always been when it was at its truest. A fact. A direction. A compass that had been right all along, pointing toward something that had required 5 years of her life to become worth pointing toward. She was standing in the clearing she had been expelled from. She was standing there on her own terms, with her own history, with the whole of herself present and undiminished and refusing to apologize for a single part of what she had become. She was there by choice. That was the part that mattered. Not the bond, not the pull, not the biological fact of recognition. The choice. The decision made with full knowledge of the history, of the cost, of the ways it could still go wrong and the work that would still need to be done. The decision made by the version of herself that had been expelled and survived and built and returned. She was home. Not the home that had been taken from her. A better one. One she had made possible by surviving the loss of the first. The fire burned and the dark held the forest, and beside her she felt the steady warmth of him, and she let it be there, finally, without fighting it. She let it be real. She let herself have it.